KENWOOD.
Hello JVC KENWOOD Canada dealers, I am Abid, an electronic technologist here at JVC KENWOOD Canada. The purpose of this video is to introduce and present to you our major firmware upgrade to our KENWOOD NXR-1000 repeater. I will first go through a brief slide presentation outlining the features of this major firmware upgrade, and then we can explore these new features on a live repeater. So the agenda for today is the following. First, we will go through an overview of the firmware itself, and then dive into the new features of the NXR-1000 repeater, and lastly go through the new changes to the KPT300 LMC and KPG D7 software. This update is designed to comply with the new cybersecurity requirements of the European Radio Equipment Directive, RED, in Europe. This compliance is regarding essential security and fraud protection of IP-connected radio devices. With this new firmware release, all IP communications between the NXR-1000 and all PC softwares will be encrypted by a programmable password, and this password encryption also applies to any hot standby operations between the NXR-1000 repeaters. There are also changes to some default repeater settings, which we will discuss later. So the KPG D7 and KPT300 LMC softwares will now require a password for IP connectivity to the NXR-1000. This new firmware requires the KPG D7 and KPT300 LMC softwares to be updated, as well as the NXR-1000 repeater itself. This image outlines the IP communication compatibility between the new and old softwares and the new and old repeater firmwares. So once all the softwares are updated, you'll be able to connect to any NXR-1000 repeater, whether it's older or newer than version 2.5. However, with an older software without IP encryption, you will not be able to connect to any IP encrypted NXR-1000 repeater. New NXR-1000 repeaters with firmware version 2.5 from factory will already have the HTTP protocol turned off by default, and therefore will be using the HTTPS protocol. It is very important to note that for the NXR-1000 repeaters that were not factory installed with firmware version 2.5, after the repeater is firmware updated, you must stop using HTTP as your IP address prefix when you log into the repeater web tool via web browser, and you will need to start using HTTPS as your prefix. It is also mandatory that the HTTP protocol option needs to be disabled to allow the HTTPS protocol to be enabled. I will go through this live after the presentation. You will notice that in the web tool there will be new options to allow a separate password to be programmed for each IP encrypted software to the NXR-1000. So KPT300 LMC, KPG D7, and multiloader. The hot standby function of the repeater will now require a password as well as between both main and sub repeaters. Keep in mind this password needs to be the same across both repeaters. Lastly, the remote access control function will now be turned off by default for repeaters that are factory installed with firmware version 2.5. For repeaters without version 2.5 from factory, once you update to version 2.5, this function will not be disabled. This setting can be accessed via the repeater front panel screen, which I will show later. As discussed, you will need to also update KPT300 LMC to version 2.10 to enable the IP encryption update. You will also need to program a password in the web tool for IP connections to the repeater via KPT300 LMC. So just as you see here, you will be prompted a password when connecting with an NXR-1000 repeater with firmware version 2.5 or later. Keep in mind that this password prompt will only appear on the first IP connection attempt and will only reappear if the IP connection is lost. So for example, if your RJ45 connector is disconnected and reconnected, then you will need to re-enter the password again. Just like the KPT300 LMC software, the KPG D7 software will also need to be updated to the firmware version 2.5 to support the IP encryption update. This KPG D7 password will be set up in the same area as the KPT300 LMC password. The same principle from the KPT300 LMC password prompt applies to this software as well, so you will only need to enter the password once per new IP connection. So now that we have an understanding of what this firmware means, let's dive into the installation and setup of this new firmware. So I've powered up an NXR-1000 repeater and I've connected it to this computer via IP and have logged in via the web tool. And now we will update the firmware of this repeater from version 2.4 to version 2.5. As we can see, the firmware is currently version 2.4. We will select version 2.5 right here. As we can see, version 2.5 is selected, and we will click on Update. While the firmware is loading, there is another way to update this firmware through the use of our KENWOOD multi-loader software, which should be included in the KPG D7 installation folder. This software can update the firmware of up to 32 repeaters at once. There are 3 ways to update the firmware. Auto restart. After the firmware transfer completes, the repeater automatically starts the firmware switch. Remote reactivation. After the firmware transfer completes, the repeater is on standby for the administrator to click on the execute button right here. Specified time. If this is selected, a date and time by the calendar can be selected. So after you have inputted your firmware file up here and target IP addresses over here, you would select the reactivation method you like and then execute the firmware update right here. And that is how this software is compiled. So after a few minutes, your repeater should have updated to firmware version 2.5. We will verify the firmware update was successful by checking it in the following menu screen. So we notice version 2.5 is shown there. So now we will verify the remote access control option is still enabled for HTTPS connectivity. So we see it is set to on, so that is a good sign. Now that we have confirmed the firmware is successfully updated, let's jump back to the web tools screen. So I have already updated my KPG D7 programming software in KPT300 LMC license management client, and we'll verify this now. So 2.5 is what we want. And up here for LMC, 2.1 is great. So now let's log into the repeater with the prefix HTTPS so that we can have access to program the various passwords for each software. Keep in mind that from now on, HTTPS will need to be used whenever logging in to the repeater web tool. So here, the S is right there. We will log in. Okay. So first we will disable the HTTP setting. Security. And this will need to be unvalidated. And let's save that. This will apply the update to the repeater. It has been changed. So now let's go to the hot standby section. So this is the hot standby window, which is for programming a redundancy configuration for a system. As mentioned before, both repeaters will need to have the same password, which is located down here at the bottom of the window. So you click on password and you would set your password right here and save it. And this applies to both repeaters, of course. So now we will set our password for both the KPT300 LMC and the KPG D7 programming software. So this is the first one. We will set our password to KENWOOD, all lowercase. We will save this configuration. Succeeded, and then we will set our password for the KPG D7 to KENWOOD123. Save this configuration. Now let's connect the repeater to each software and verify the password prompt is working correctly. So we'll start with KPT300 LMC. We will try to make a connection here. We will first go into offline mode. And we will attempt to make a connection. So 192.168.1.11, and it will ask us for the password prompt. And here we would put KENWOOD. And there we have it. And then down to KPG D7, we would read the repeater. I already have the IP address set in here. And again, a password prompt. So KENWOOD 123. And there we have it. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you for watching our NXR-1000 firmware update video, and we'll see you next time.